Okay, so this is the first installment of Kentucky history. Okay, so to start out with some questions. What was the first state south of the Mason-Dixon line to pass the first Civil Rights Act? So you had Martin Luther King, 1964. The United States passed the Civil Rights Act, and then all the states would either pass some sort of Civil Rights Act. But what was the first state south of the Mason-Dixon line to pass the Civil Rights Act? When did Kentucky pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the so-called Reconstruction Amendments? Number 3, in the Civil War, who invaded Kentucky first, the Union or the Confederates? Who is Stephen Burbridge? Who is John Gregg Fee? And which side did Kentucky furnish more soldiers to, the Union side or the Confederate side? So those are the questions I want you to think about, and I'll answer them at the very end. In this Kentucky Humanities magazine, fall 2013, it's about the Civil War, the state divided. And page 10, they got an article about Camp Nelson, and the article is called Camp Nelson is Now Our Canada. So Canada was the place where slaves would run to in order to get freedom, not just to the north, but all the way to Canada. And Camp Nelson became a fort, a camp that newly freed men could enlist and become soldiers in the army. And so it became a cry in Kentucky. Camp Nelson is now our Canada. So Camp Nelson, you going to Camp Nelson? You going to Canada? I'm running away to Canada. No, I'm running away to Camp Nelson. Okay. So, Kentucky and African American troops. When the Civil War began, President Lincoln and the federal government resisted the enrollment of African Americans into the military despite intensive pressure from abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass. The government was cautious against antagonizing the pro-Union slave states such as Kentucky. This situation began to change in the summer and fall of 1862 with the passage of the Second Confiscation Act and the Militia Act, which allowed for the employment or even enlistment of African Americans into the military, and the issuance of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The organization of African American regiments accelerated after January 1863 with the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. In May 1863, the Bureau of Colored Troops was created to oversee and encourage the organization of federal African American regiments known as the United States Colored Troops. Following the creation of this bureau, the organization of federal African American regiments began in all Union and Union-held states except for one, Kentucky. Kentucky politicians and powerful, loyal slave owners successfully lobbied Washington to exempt their state. Since Kentucky was not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation, the vast majority of Kentucky's African American men were still enslaved. Federal authorities continued to fear Kentucky's possible secession from the Union, initially bowed to the state's wishes. The government's need for soldiers continued to grow, however, and by February 1864, an amendment to the Federal Enrollment Act was passed that allowed for the drafting of both free blacks and enslaved men nationwide. This caused a crisis among the white population in Kentucky, and the federal government eventually agreed that while they would continue to place African Americans on their enrollment list, they would not draft any as long as Kentucky's whites filled their required quotas. By spring 1864, pressure mounted from the federal government to begin enlisting African Americans in Kentucky, so Major General Stephen G. Burbridge, the commander of the District of Kentucky, issued General Order Number 34 on April 18, 1864. This order allowed provost marshals to enlist free blacks and enslaved men that had the approval of their owners. Enslaved men were emancipated upon enlistment. The enlistment policy continued in most areas of Kentucky until late May 1864, when 250 escaped men entered Camp Nelson to enlist. The Kentucky policy was now being severely challenged by the sheer numbers of enslaved men without permission that entered Camp Nelson. Within a few days, the number reached 400. A frustrated Colonel Andrew H. Clark, commander of Camp Nelson, wrote to his commander that unless the recruiting business is better managed, it will cost the government a great deal of money and very few Negroes will be recruited. A week later, Colonel Clark began enlisting the African-American men at Camp Nelson, who by early June had reached 1,500 men on July 13, 1864. The Army officially removed the earlier restrictions and took able-bodied African-American men suitable age. Upon enlistment, these former slaves were emancipated. Eventually, more than 5,700 men joined the Army and were freed at Camp Nelson, making it one of the largest recruitment camps and emancipation centers for African-American soldiers in the nation. So that's exciting, right? So Camp Nelson, you're liberating 5,700 former black men in order to enlist into the Army. And overall, you're going to have 24 to 25,000 African-Americans who's going to fight for the Union who came from Kentucky. And that number rivals the number of Confederates, because overall the Union had 100,000 Kentuckians fighting for it, and 25 to 24,000 of them were African Americans, and so and then 25,000 fought for the Confederacy. So 80% of Kentuckians who fought in the war fought for the North. The vast, overwhelming majority fought for the North. Okay, Kentucky fought for the North. Kentucky was Union. We was Union the whole way through. We won the war, right? Kentucky won the war. Most of them 180%, 80%, that's just the overwhelming majority. I mean, I don't know anything else more, compared to, like, it's just like virtual, unanimous 80%. So your average Kentucky soldier was a Union lover of Lincoln, okay? Was a Lincoln soldier, was a soldier for the Union. Yeah, which was one of the questions. And also, let's see, so who invaded Kentucky? Who invaded Kentucky during the Civil War? I think it's the Confederacy. Kentucky in the American Civil War. There's a Wikipedia encyclopedia page. Kentucky is a border state of key importance. President Lincoln said that, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. He also says, I think to lose Kentucky is nearly to the same as to lose the whole game. We might as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of the capital. So yeah, Kentucky was absolute fucking pivotal for Lincoln's strategy. War breaks neutrality violated. On September 4th, 1861, Confederate Major General Leonidas, so Leonidas Polk, fucking Polks, these Polks love their racist, white supremacist fucking violence, okay? This racial dictatorship. Confederate Major Leonidas Polk violated the Commonwealth's neutrality by ordering Brigadier General Gideon Johnson Pillow to occupy Columbus, Kentucky. Columbus was of strategic importance both because of it was the terminus of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and because of its position along the Mississippi River. Polk, Confederate Major General Leonidas Polk, constructed Fort Russie in the high bluffs of Columbus and equipped it with 143 cannons. Polk called the fort the Gibraltar of the West. To control traffic along the river, Polk stretched an anchor chain along the river from the bank in Columbus to the opposite bank of Belmont, Missouri. Each link of the chain measured 11 inches long by 8 inches wide and weighed 20 pounds. The chain soon broke under its own weight, but Union forces did not learn of this fact until early 1862. In response to the Confederate invasion, Union Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant left Cairo, Illinois, and entered Paducah, Kentucky on September 6th, which gave the Union control of the northern end of the New Orleans and Ohio Railroad and the mouth of the Tennessee River. Governor Magafin denounced both sides for violating the Commonwealth's neutrality, called for both sides to withdraw. However, on September 7, 1861, the General Assembly passed a resolution ordering the withdrawal of only Confederate forces. Magafin vetoed the resolution, but both houses overread the veto, and Magafin issued the proclamation. The General Assembly ordered the flag of the United States to be raised over the state capitol in Frankfort, declaring its allegiance with the Union. Its neutrality broken, both sides quickly established advantageous positions in the Commonwealth. Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston formed the line in southern regions of Kentucky and northern regions of Tennessee, stretching from Columbus in the west to Cumberland Gap in the east. Johnston dispatched Simon B. Buckner to fortify the middle of the line in Bowling Green. Buckner arrived in September 18th, 1861, and immediately began intensive drill sessions, constructing elaborate defenses in anticipation of a Union strike. So extensive were the fortifications at Bowling Green that a Union officer who later surveyed them commented, "The labor has been immense. The troops cannot be well drilled. Their time must have been chiefly spent in hard work with the axe and the spade." So the Confederates, the Polk fucking ordered that pillow guy to occupy Columbus, and then it was over. So the Confederates violated Kentucky's neutrality first. Berea McAfee declares it neutral, and is all pissed off at everybody, the South and the North, because they both violated the neutrality. But that's the both of the invasions, since the first one had been invaded September 4th, and then U.S. Grant comes September 6th, so 2 days later. Since it had been violated first by the Confederates, that's the reason why U.S. Grant invades. That's also the reason, so as a catalyst, the invasion of Kentucky by the Confederates was a catalyst to the General Assembly voting against the Confederates. They said all the Confederate troops had to be removed, but they didn't pass a law for the Union troops. It was just, and then they raised the American flag on the flagpole in Frankfort. In 1966, Frankfort was the first state south of the Mason-Dixon line to pass the Civil Rights Act. So the 1966 Civil Rights that happened in Kentucky, Martin Luther King marched on Frankfort. It didn't get passed in 64 because you had reactionaries to the fucking national policy, but after having it swish around their fucking mouth for 2 years, 1966, Kentucky was the first southern deep south state to pass civil rights, and it was one of the most comprehensive Civil Rights Act that was passed too. And so Martin Luther King was very proud of the accomplishments here in Frankfort, in the bluegrass state. So then 1976 is when the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were actually passed. They were symbolically passed. They'd never been passed, even though they were the law of the land when the American government passed it, but Kentucky government was fucking pissed off about Civil War, and they said Kentucky went Confederate afterwards. So afterwards, they didn't pass any of the fucking laws, and then they re-elected a ton of Confederates back into positions of power. John Gregg Fee, he's the guy who founded Berea College in 1855, so 6 years before the Civil War. John Gregg Fee was an abolitionist, a minister, and an educator, the founder of the town of Berea. So he founded Berea, Kentucky, and he founded Berea College, the first in the United States South with interracial and co-educational admissions. So the first interracial college was founded here in Kentucky. During the American Civil War, John G. Fee worked at Camp Nelson to have facilities constructed to support freedmen and their families and to provide them with education and preaching, while the men were taught to be soldiers. So Camp Nelson, the wonderful, great Camp Nelson that we were reading about, they said one of the guys goes there and he's like, "I want to fight the rebels, now give me a gun." Another guy, he goes to Camp Nelson, he says, "I enlisted in the 12th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery in the fall of 1864. My only sorrow is that I did not enlist sooner. I see, as it were, a nation born in a day, men and women coming forth from slavery's dark dungeons to the noonday sunshine of the greatest of God's gifts, liberty." Sergeant Elijah Marr stated, "I can't stand this, and like a man, this is better than slavery, though I do march in line at the tap of a drum. I felt freedom in my bones, then all fear banished. I had quit thinking as a child and had commenced to think as a man." Camp Nelson's USCT saw action in the major battles of Saltville, Marion, Petersburg, and Richmond, Virginia, as well as numerous skirmishes in Kentucky. By the end of the war, nearly 24,000 Kentucky African-American men had joined the Army, the second largest number behind only Louisiana of any state, even though it was the last state to begin enlistment. This enlistment began the destruction of slavery in Kentucky. The creation and success of African-American soldiers also had tremendous symbolic and political as well as military value. As Confederate General Howe Cobb stated, "You cannot make soldiers out of slaves or slaves out of soldiers. The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the end of the revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, then our whole theory of slavery is wrong." Women and children tried to get into Camp Nelson, but they weren't allowed to be there, so they actually had to send them away, and some of them died. The Reverend John G. Fee and Reverend Abisha Schofield of the American Missionary Association, members of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, abolition members. I don't know. All these people tried to get the people to stay there. They were called contrabands of war. The Army did not want legally enslaved women and children in the camp. Camp Nelson was caught in the paradox of the Civil War in Kentucky, a slave state in a war, at least after the Emancipation Proclamation to end slavery. So